Hello, and welcome to the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues, the number 94th Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogue, with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hello, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
We normally come together and think about, orally, think about something that we have been interested in, reading about, has somehow come by our way. And we had to anticipate this evening's subject for the reasons of advertising the event, hence living in an age of spiritual crisis. But the idea is not only that it's enjoyable for us and that in the dialogue we prompt each other and see where it might go, how it might emerge, but that also listeners feel free to explore these themes, and because the dialogues got going when Rupert asked me about one of his books, and I said people need to hear you speak because you speak freely as well as in a deeply informed way, and you speak wittily as well, and there's something tremendously liberating about that. And I've gained very much myself from that in the time that we have been friends and talking about various things too. So Rupert, we're going to talk about living in an age of spiritual crisis. We're going to return to this subject from 5 years ago. I'll have to listen again back and see whether things have moved on or not. But I thought I might kick off by thinking about the imagination, partly because I've been thinking a lot about William Blake, and the imagination is so central to him. And what interests me about Blake is that he does sense a spiritual crisis looming. He's a prophet of our times, therefore, writing 200 years ago, but very much with this prescient vision that could see what is now so manifest in our times. But always with Blake, there's the sense that whilst he can see things going wrong, the dark satanic mills, there's a good impulse, a good impetus underneath what's happening. And that if only by fine-tuning our understanding of what's unfolding, this desire, this energy, as he talks about it so much, can be understood. And in fact, the flow of what's happening culturally and individually can be tracked. And he thought about this often in relation to the imagination, and he felt that what was happening in our times was our imaginations were becoming constrained, they were becoming narrowed. As he famously puts it, we had fallen for single vision and Newton's sleep. But there was a good side to this, because the narrowing, the focus of imagination was deeply entwined with the birth of modern science, and in particular then, the development of modern technology, which needs a focused imagination in order for it to be developed, and particularly in the way that we've seen in the last 200 years. But the risk is that that constrained imagination means that we're living in a kind of virtual reality. He worried about science, not because he didn't feel there was good reason to get to know the material world. Quite the opposite. Remember that he was as much a scientist as an artist. He worked with these materials of copper and lead and acids and engravers and incisors, and I'm sure that his workshop would have stunk like a chemist's laboratory, as much as inspired by the beautiful things that you might have seen hanging out to dry. But he worried that when science becomes an end in itself, which is so easy to happen when technology is so brilliant, we end up living in this virtual reality, a kind of abstract world, and this uncouples us from reality as it actually is. And so the imagination needs re-expanding in order that we can become acquainted with reality as it actually is again. And then the sort of twist on this, which I think deepens the sense of spiritual crisis now, is that it's not just that a constrained imagination produces such brilliant technology, but then the technology, in order to even have more power in our lives, needs to start shaping reality itself in order that it can become more and more useful to us. You think about a car. Cars are called automobiles. It's one of the worst misnomers, I think, in the English language. There's nothing self-driving about a car at all. Even an autonomous vehicle now needs the purposes and the intentions and the design of the human imagination. But what happens is that cars need roads on which to run. The minute they're off a road, most cars are completely useless. And it's an analogy, therefore, for how the whole world becomes shaped by technology in order that technology can become more and more efficacious in our lives. It's as if the whole world is getting overwritten by a road network in the service of the technology that can do us so well. And that's the risk, that there we get into this kind of feedback loop where our imagination is constrained in order to focus in on the world in a certain way and understand it through technological means, scientific means. But then the technology itself insists that the world presents itself more and more in these constrained ways, through these abstractions, through these virtual representations. And so I think that is what Blake feared. We're getting caught up in this kind of vortex. Now, we both want to come more to how to channel through this crisis. But in the first part of our conversation, I thought we might express how we see the crisis. And that certainly is one way in which it can be expressed.
Interesting point about the imagination. I mean, there's a sense in which we've got plenty of it at the moment. If you look at the novels, TV, plays, films, and there's vast industries worth tens of billions of dollars a year catering to the imagination. There are some people who watch TV most of the day, and you know, a lot of it's fictional and imaginary. But it is a narrowed imagination. I hadn't thought about this before until you just said it, but because it's a secular imagination. It's science fiction, it's horror, and all that kind of thing, and romance, of course. But when you see these films, no one ever goes to church. No one ever prays. And I remember Jill told me my wife Jill told me that when they were doing Downton Abbey, they had a policy. They could never show the beginning of a meal in Downton Abbey because people would have said grace. And you can't show you can show the middle of the meal, but if you show the beginning and have people saying grace, then it might offend atheists. So they had to cut out. It's completely sanitized of anything to do with religion, especially Christianity. I mean, just as like in a film, you never see anyone going to the lavatory. You see plenty of people having sex, but they never go to the lavatory. They certainly never pray or go to church in the vast majority of these things. So it's a kind of narrowing down of the imagination to cut out, amputate the spiritual part. But I think when we come to the question of the crisis, the spiritual crisis, we have to recognize that it's actually a parochial issue. There's no big spiritual crisis in Hinduism. The Kumbh Mela, which has just been going on, has 400 million people are expected to go to, the biggest assembly that's ever happened on Earth. The sadhu organizations, the holy men associations and holy women associations are flourishing, plenty of young recruits. There's in Islam, it's not as if Islam is withering away. I mean, there are problems within Islam. There have always been conflicts between Sunnis and Shias. There's always been conflicts of various kinds within Islam between fundamentalists and non-fundamentalists and so on. But Islam doesn't seem to be in a state of extreme crisis. Judaism, there are plenty of atheist Jews, but atheist Jews don't challenge Judaism. I mean, I had a literary agent in New York who was also the agent for Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris. It was atheist central. We had to part ways in the end because I just didn't seem the right place for me. So I said to him, was he doing this because of an ideological commitment to atheism? He said, no, frankly, he couldn't see why they were making so much fuss. He was an atheist, didn't believe in God, but his son had had a bar mitzvah, he observed the festivals. He was quite comfortable with being a cultural Jew, and it didn't matter to him much about what people actually believed. So it wasn't a sense of crisis. And in Buddhism, you don't get the sense of crisis either. This is a specifically post-Christian phenomenon. And I think to understand it, we have to understand how we've got here in Western culture. And so I think just very briefly, the way I would see the short history of this is modern science as we know it came into being in the 17th century, when Europe was riven with sectarian conflicts, Protestants and Catholics, the 30 Years' War, which devastated the population of continental Europe. In England, the Civil War, which had a very strong ideological religious motive from Puritans and, an extreme form of Protestantism. And as science came into being then, a lot of scientists portrayed it as what they called the third way, that it was neither Protestant nor Catholic. It was about nature, and it was about understanding nature through mathematical laws. And they thought God was a mathematician, therefore mathematicians were the humans closest to God, and that if they could understand God through the laws of nature, they got a direct hotline to God, to God's inner workings, as opposed to quarreling over interpretations of scriptures, which is what Roman Catholics and Protestants were doing. And so by the 18th century, whereas this fed into the Enlightenment, the idea was that, science and reason and progress were the way forward, and religion, Christianity in particular, was not. And there was a huge amount of anti-Christian polemics. The French Revolution was a triumph of anti-Christian polemics. The priests and monks were executed with the guillotine en masse. And by the 19th century, revolutionary movements like the communist movement and other revolutionary movements became atheists because the old regime was associated with the church. The church backed up reactionary monarchies. And so the simplest way to cut away the underpinnings of all that was to say, well, God doesn't exist, there's no such thing as God, and therefore the church is meaningless, and they're propping up the power of these people. So it became enormously powerful, polemical for anti-Christian polemics. And then this became part of the secularization of our whole society, so much so that the educational system, the default mode is secular, atheist, or at least agnostic. And so then the practice of Christianity becomes increasingly marginalized in a secular society. It has to be kept out of all the public domain. So it becomes a kind of private hobby. It's okay to do it, just like it's okay to breed gerbils, but it's not sort of part of the central culture. So you can't have grace on Downton Abbey, and you can't have anything to do with going to church. And if a religion exists at all, it would be put in a separate compartment. And in primary schools, it's not the basic stories of Christianity. It's religious studies where Hindus believe that there was a God called Krishna, Muslim believe that God is called Allah, and stuff, a kind of watered down comparative religion. So I think the spiritual crisis is very specifically one of Christendom, or the post-Christian world. And it's not something that is a huge problem in any other culture. It becomes a huge problem by extension because the secularism of our society and the atheist polemics are now infiltrating, and there's large numbers of underground Dawkins followers in Pakistan, in the Arab world, and elsewhere. It's become a kind of underground forbidden thing, which you can only do in private and secret. But for people who are tired of dogmatic fundamentalists, then they see the main alternative as atheism. And so we've sort of extended this kind of atheist thing to the rest of the world. We've created a culture within science where we've created this kind of sterile zone where you can't talk about religion. When I worked in India as a scientist, I worked for 5 years in an international research institute in India. My colleagues were Indian scientists. And I didn't meet a single atheist among them. At work, they would never talk about religion. It was completely secular. It was all materialist, mechanistic materialism. But the minute they got home in the evenings, they became standard Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Parsis, or whatever. And they created a split in their lives between their cultural life and their religious life. But at work, it was a kind of sterilized zone because they'd imported the secular culture of science from the West. And of course, we've exported the secularism through communism. I mean, China is the largest example of this, where a communist ideology, which is intrinsically atheist, I mean, it's explicitly atheist, is the dominant ideology of China, as it was of the Soviet Union and of Cambodia under Pol Pot. Not a terribly good advertisement for atheism, but in China, it didn't come out of Chinese culture. It wasn't the Taoism that led to a sort of official state atheism. It was Marxism, and Marxism grew out of this secular trend in post-Christian culture in Europe. So I think that the crisis itself is, as I say, more parochial than it's not a global crisis of the whole of humanity. But I think it has specific features, and we here in Europe, have to find our specific ways out of it. One way that people have found to get out of it, because the spiritual crisis is primarily based on anti-Christian polemics, is through, in the 50s, people took up Zen Buddhism because it seemed atheist and compatible with materialism. I gave a talk at a Buddhist center recently, and the head of it told me that the reason he wanted me to give a talk there, or it was a dialogue actually, was because so many Buddhists are actually materialists. Western Buddhists who become Buddhist start from a materialist default position, take up meditation and spiritual practices, but don't have any incentive to question the whole metaphysical framework of materialism, because Buddhism actually rather plays down talking about the nature of nature, and it's all about getting on with the practice. And so Buddhists were the first wave, I suppose, of, well, apart from theosophists, but of the popular re-spiritualization of our society. It was okay to be a Buddhist, and then it became okay to be a Hindu and have a guru, and then it became okay to go on shamanic retreats and have dream catchers hanging over your bed and that kind of thing, Native American thing, and shamanism light, and then ayahuasca retreats in Peru, and so on. But the one thing it isn't okay still for is to go to church or to become a practicing Christian. And this is considered deeply eccentric in intellectual circles. As I know from experience, I go to church and I've observed the festivals and stuff, and many of my scientific friends see this as just some kind of either a personal weakness, a lack of the ability to think straight and see through all this childish superstition, or at best, some kind of personal eccentricity.
Well, I mean, maybe the Christian piece is shifting somewhat. It's always hard to tell these days whether it's just your bubble, but there is certainly talk of some sort of renewed interest in Christianity. But perhaps just to wind back a little bit, I mean, the word crisis, as you'll know, is a medical word, and it means the turning point in the progress of a disease. And so maybe this is where we can think about, are we at some sort of turning point? And you're already indicating as much. And I think that this is one of the ways in which the crisis can be a good thing. Another person who's hugely influential on me is Owen Barfield, the great inkling friend of Lewis and Tolkien. And he was very clear that although periods of alienation and what he called withdrawal from participating in the world, thinking that consciousness is this strange flickering light in an otherwise completely non-conscious cosmos. But one of the advantages of that, this alienation, is that it intensifies the sense of the individual. It sort of throws you, forces you onto yourself. And I actually think that psychotherapy is a product of this process, that whereas before the great wisdom traditions would have helped you navigate through a great flood of meaning, experienced as the encounters with gods and dreams and holy places and so on. Now, we experience that internally. As Jung said, the gods have become diseases. But the upside of that maybe is that it's preparing the ground for this huge meeting of these different traditions. you mentioned there's the sort of Buddhist wave, and then maybe the Hindu wave, and then the shamanic wave, and it doesn't happen one after the other like that, of course. Now it just comes all crashing in on us because of the internet. But perhaps we need the sense of being an individual in order to discern our paths through what's happening as the crisis turns and becomes a flood once more. The very fact that there's men and women sitting in this room tonight, we take that for granted, whereas in more traditional societies that perhaps wouldn't have happened. The men might have been the pursuers of these things and women would have had other roles. So there is a kind of preparation, I think, going on, or I wonder at least. Certainly Barfield felt that was the case, that when participation in life withdraws into the interior of the seemingly isolated self, that's just a preparation for a turning out again. And you mentioned at the beginning of your thoughts there about how imagination isn't dead in the West, of course. In a way, it has morphed into this entertainment industry. And again, the sort of Jungian in me wonders whether this is almost like a collective dream. And we're flirting with what before would have been part and parcel of deeply wise traditions in the popularity of stories of the supernatural, for example, or the popularity of stories which are about romantic love. But of course, romantic love is just as Plato said, the initiation for the love of all things and the love of the divine. So it hasn't died, but it's not quite sure what to do with itself. And you mentioned India, which I'm very pleased about, because I've just come back from a trip to Tamil Nadu in the last few days, and some of my fellow travelers are here tonight. And it was a tremendous experience. And I was thinking about why it was a tremendous experience. And one of the ways of putting that was that when you go to India, as you know very well, you get flooded on the one hand, with a world that is quite familiar, a secular world. There is technology to carry you around, and of course it even gets you there. And you read a lot about Indian politics and the brutality of it often, actually. Don't want to romanticize the place at all. But at the same time, with the volume still turned up to 10, is spiritual vitality as well. One of the thoughts that I was having was how, even someone like myself who has a deep felt sense of Christianity, it's very easy to walk into a church and to see a cross, for example, as a symbol, or to see a statue of Our Lady as somehow representing the presence of Mary. Whereas I think when you go to India, there's no symbols, there's no representations, it's all presence. The statue is the presence. The temple is the holy place. And people live like that. And it's at once deeply attractive and actually discombobulating, because to someone, with my sort of split mentality, if you like, on the one hand, living partly in a secular world, and on the other hand, hoping to live more and more in a world that's alight and alive to the spiritual, there's this kind of clash. And it's at once inviting and sort of knocks you for six. But maybe that's one of the signs of the crisis turning, when the holy, for example, the sacred, really starts to matter again. And we stop, as you say, talking about things like what Hindus believe, as if you need to provide a list of the gods, or thinking about things in terms of religious studies, sort of putting it into that kid glove department where it's safe for the secular mind to look on, and start to feel the return of these dynamics. And moreover, although at once being sort of confused by them and not quite knowing what to do with them, wanting to do something with them. A famous 20th century theologian, Karl Rahner, he made this comment once when he said a Christianity of tomorrow will be a mystical Christianity, or it will be no Christianity at all. And I feel the pressure of that deeply, that the mystical there to me sounds like a living presence that's not wholly seen, not wholly understood, and yet is wanted, is loved. And, in time, you want to give your devotion to that. You want to lose yourself in it, not in the sense of, like becoming drunk, although maybe there's moments like that, but that somehow you find a deeper side of what it is to be human through that flood of meaning. So I'm just sort of 10 days back from Tamil Nadu, to I think a place where this is particularly present, and knowing that our conversation tonight was coming up, was wanting to introduce that. And I had some other thoughts about how maybe we can feel this crisis turning and the spiritual returning to us. But when we stop talking about symbols and representations and systems of belief as if somehow you have to give your intellectual assent to it, and instead, as we did in this ashram in Tamil Nadu, sat for many hours as the leader of this place, Amma, as she performed the pujas. I didn't really quite know what was going on when the ghee was poured and the honey was poured and the water was poured and the deity was anointed and dressed with flowers and so on. But it really didn't matter, because the palpable sense of the presence was what was being communicated. Now, no doubt, I need to do a bit of cognitive catch-up at some point as well, because these things need discerning and they need integrating and incorporating, and that will be a good move. But I mean, I wonder whether you feel that sort of sense of flood. Maybe you've seen it, because you went to Tamil Nadu, first of all, many, many years ago, and I know it deeply influenced you with the work for which you've become so, well known now.
I think when I was living in India, what I found was just what you say, that the idea that the spiritual realm permeates life. Not just for Hindus, for Muslims too. I mean, I had a lot of Muslim friends as well. And there's this sense of the sacred everywhere. In villages, there's holy trees and holy termite mounds. And when I was living, I lived in a wing of a crumbling palace in Hyderabad. When I was living there, one day I went into my bathroom and there was a cobra there in the bathroom. A live cobra, a large one. So I said to my cook, here's this cobra. He says, yes, sir, cobra has come in. And I said, well, can you get rid of it, kill it or something? And he said, we cannot kill the cobra, sahib. It is a holy animal, nag. It's a snake. It is a holy snake. He said, so I said, well, can we find a way of getting it out? So anyway, he got it out of there. And then he and the Raja who owned the palace and the other servants invited me. 2 or 3 weeks later, it was Nag Puja. There was a special day of worship of serpents. And there, the snake, they knew where it lived. It was in a termite mound in the crumbling terraces of the palace. And so there they were, and they put a little saucer of milk there. They were burning joss sticks and chanting cobra mantras. And the idea was, if you're nice to the cobra, it won't do you any harm. A completely different approach, you see. And the idea that I had the same problem when I had rats. One ran over my face one night, and it was a just horrible experience, a scaly tail going over my cheek. And it was the only time I've had sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was extraordinary. So again, I said to my cook, we've got to kill these, get rid of the rats. And he got a rat trap, caught the rat when I got back from work. There was this living rat in a rat trap. And so I said, well, what can we do with this now? Can you just kill it? He said, no, sir, I cannot kill the rat. He said, the rat is the sacred animal. It is the vehicle of Ganesh, the Lord Ganesh. So I said, well, can you get rid of it then? He said, yes, sir. So he put on his bicycle, he pedaled off. He came back an hour later and he said he'd taken it a long way away and released it. And after that, I noticed as I went round Hyderabad, people on bicycles with rats in these traps on the back of the bike, cycling all over the city to get rid of them. So the total number of rats remained the same, but they just got redistributed. And anyway, just in ordinary things like that, a peepal tree was growing in the roof and the monsoon was coming through. And I asked the Raja to do something about it. He wouldn't. Then I got my work people to send a team to get rid of it, to get rid of the tree and mend the roof. When I came back, the tree was still there. And so the next day I went to the head of the work groups and said that they came and they didn't take the tree away. He said, no, sir, there is a problem. And I said, what's the problem? He said, it is a holy tree, sir, peepal tree, and a Buddha was enlightened under it. And I said, yes, but it's spoiling the roof and the rain's pouring in. And he said, well, I will solve it, sir. Leave it to me. So the next day when I got back, it had gone. When I went to him and said, how did you do this? He said, I sent some Muslims. Because for them, it's not a holy tree. So he solved the problem. But this was just going through everyday life. But you see, the point is, it was a communal thing. And when you were talking about Barfield and getting into this individual state that we've as a highly individualistic culture, excuse me, what that does is leaves out the whole collective dimension. And what makes spirituality so powerful in India is its collective quality. Of course, there are hermits who live in caves in the Himalayas, but even the hermits come together for the Kumbh Mela. But otherwise, you know, the great festivals, the temples are thronged, the Diwali and these ceremonies, you know, everyone's there, the children, the family, everyone's there. It's a collective celebration. Whereas this deep individualism that we've had in our culture means that if people become spiritual, then they become individually spiritual, you know, and you get this mix and match of bits from this culture, a kind of bit of Zen meditation and shamanic this and all that, which is actually a feature of the whole New Age movement, was very much individualized spirituality. The main, apart from the individualized bit and the eclectic bit, was that it also shared with our general society the ABC principle, anything but Christian. So it was, again, very individualist. And so I think one of the things that we have to find is a way out of the spiritual crisis that can be collective as well as, you know, rediscovering a spiritual path. Because, and that's one reason that I follow a Christian path, because I think the best way for any kind of collective celebration here is to recognize our own traditions. That's one reason why, as you know, I'm involved in the British Pilgrimage Trust, which is reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes to our holy places. Some are pre-Christian, like stone circles and long barrows. Some of them are natural, like springs and sources of rivers and mountaintops. And some are churches and cathedrals. And the British Pilgrimage Trust, over the last 10 years, has it's had a major impact. I mean, there's a revival of pilgrimage going on all over Europe. And I think one reason for this is to get out of this purely individual spirituality. It's just me and my soul and my destiny and my choice about which bits of spirituality to adopt, and relating us to a place, to the land on which we live and the holy places of the land. So I think that's a very important move, because it connects us, takes us out of our mere individual choice-centered selves and relates us to place and tradition. Another scheme that I'm involved with recently is this revival of patronal festivals. And while you were away in India, all this was going on. And I belong to I'm a trustee of the Choral Evensong Trust, which has a website, choralevensong.org, where you can look up choral evensong, this beautiful service that happens with choirs in all our cathedrals every day, Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's, here in London, Southwark Cathedral, and all the cathedrals. There are 42 cathedrals in England. Every day this beautiful music is going on. And sometimes you go there and there's just 2 or 3 people. There's 20 people in the choir, 3 priests. They're not doing it for the glory of people. It's really is for the glory of God. It's not done to make money. It loses vast amounts of money. It's not done, you know, for popular, to appeal to the masses. They barely advertise it. That's one reason the Choral Evensong Trust has this online, so people can find it. So that is the the idea was to, from the Choral Evensong Trust, to give grants for patronal festivals where village churches can celebrate their patron saint, which in Spain and Italy, the whole town or village is a whole festival when it's the day of the patron saint. Most churches here stopped doing it long ago. It was suppressed at the Reformation, and many of them haven't done it since. And giving grants for the revival of patronal festivals, we started with offering 5 grants, and we hardly publicized it because we didn't know what would happen. The closing date was February the 2nd, and we had to suppress the publicity. It was only advertised in 2 dioceses, Chichester and Bath and Wells, out of 42 dioceses in the Church of England. And we ended up with 87 applications, of which we'd managed to raise the funding. So these are all going to happen this year. But if we'd made it more widely known, there would have been hundreds. We would have been overwhelmed. Anyway, the reason that we're doing this is because the patronal festivals are when the whole village or town can come together and celebrate together with choral evensong, which is beautiful. It doesn't demand people to decide they've got to take Holy Communion and throw them into tears about what they believe and what they don't believe. You can just enjoy the festival, take part in the celebration, and as a communal event. And I think the reason there's been such a good response to this is precisely because we need to rediscover that communal dimension. And if we're going to have a communal dimension here in Britain, I think it's most likely to happen if it can be related to our traditional places and our own traditions. It doesn't mean we have to reject all other traditions. I'm very influenced by the Hindu tradition myself. I do yoga every morning. I meditate in a Christian form, but I started by using Hindu forms of meditation. My wife has a Buddhist teacher, and so we have many influences. And I was influenced by the Sufi tradition when I was in India. I had a Sufi teacher for a while, and I think we have a huge amount to learn. And one of the great things about the modern world is that, for the first time, we can know about all the world's spiritual traditions, whereas previously in medieval Europe, people knew about Islam and they knew about Judaism, but they didn't know about much else. And so I think this is a remarkable position we're in. And I think part of the opportunity is, on the one hand, to learn from the different traditions of the world, and secondly, the challenge is to find a way of relating it to our own communities, our own land, and our own traditions.
Yeah, that's a point well made. And I think the real joy of encountering these other traditions is when it does awaken that which is only dormant in your own place and your own tradition, and you can discover that your first language, as it were, can talk about these things and express these things and carry these things to you, as well as finding them elsewhere. The collective side, it made me think, as you were talking there, about the notion of sympathy. And I know this relates to something which you think about quite a lot. And it takes me back to William Blake, because I think one of the things that William Blake noticed that was also happening a couple of hundred years ago now, that's become so powerful, is how the notion of sympathy changed meaning very dramatically. And previously, the word sympathy had meant the kind of, well, influence was another word connected to sympathy, the inflow of energy, forces, desire too, means from the stars originally. And so you lived in this sort of porous world where a lot of everyday religious practice and ritual was actually about helping you navigate a path through this flood, which otherwise might do you ill as much as good. And so the rituals, the libations, that kind of habits, the statues that you had round and about were, I mean, not so much like road markers, but I think were actually like channels toward off that which might be ill and foster that which might be good. Whereas in about the 17th, 18th century, and figures like David Hume and Adam Smith write quite explicitly about this, and it's now become the norm. They say no, there's no flood of meaning, flood of influence, flood of energy. What there is the individual, and the individual therefore needs to cultivate, as Adam Smith called it, moral sentiment that reaches out from the otherwise isolated individual and hopefully makes a bit of touch through sympathy as we now mean it. You know, empathy is actually a Victorian word, but it's a very similar idea. And sort of hope that if my empathy connects with your empathy, then we might at least momentarily feel like we belong to each other. And I feel that Blake was onto this. He actually makes a lot of remarks about pity, which was, you know, another word for sympathy. And he says that pity divides the human soul. And you think, why does he say that? And I think he says that because this modern notion of sympathy and empathy and pity and so on sort of smuggles in a sense of isolation that it hopes it might overcome. And what I think Blake was onto, and I feel this in relation to what you're saying now, is that when people go on these tremendous pilgrimages, when they're allowed to encounter something with an open imagination, because sympathy is the inflow of energy, the inflow of meaning and so on, it never died. It's just that we lost the sense, the imagination of being able to connect with it. That opens up again. You know, the British Pilgrimage Trust, I love the strapline, which is bring your own beliefs. And I think one of the things that does, it's not just like a free-for-all, but what it says is, implicitly is, look, that cognitive apparatus to one side, all that you've been told about things like sympathy, even if you've never overtly expressed it, and just be in this place, on this walk with these others, sort of naked, open to what you might experience from the heart, and then, you know, have a good think about it later. And I feel like also this is the case with I think that Christianity needs to get to grips with, actually. One of the things, certainly the Church of England, which I know, I feel has really got caught up in, is that it too has bought into this idea that what's most important is what the individual is doing. And another way that this manifests is that the mystical Christianity, the mythos, which is the sort of the wellspring, the source, the potential from which a life and a shared life might be collective and made manifest, has got collapsed into a set of moral imperatives. You know, Christianity, to my mind anyway, so often comes across as a kind of moral creed now, addressing the individual and what they believe and what they must do or not do, probably. And so we need to recover again, I think, this sense that the moral is very much a footnote. It's a sort of guide. It helps you a bit when you make mistakes. But what really matters is the mythos, is the living presence, the living sympathy that comes from without and meets that which is within. And I mean, it's so interesting when you talk about what's happening on the ground in churches. And I mean, I live in a vicarage. My partner is a vicar. And I know that what happens on the ground in churches carries all sorts of life and vitality very often, actually. I mean, in St. Giles, Camberwell, where we are, very often mediated through music as well. We have a lot of music in the place of all sorts. And that, I think, is one of the ways of which sympathy coming from without hasn't got cut off by the kind of official doctrine that sympathy actually is born within us, and if we're lucky, sort of escapes the confines of our skulls and connects with someone else. But the recovery of myth as a living tradition as well, and you know, maybe the Church of England will sort of exhaust itself with these endless moral disputes and kind of internal wars, just realizing it's going to go nowhere. But I hope that because of the life on the ground and, you know, the recovery of things like pilgrimage and this music, which never dies, that wider experience of spiritual life coming from without, coming from the collective, might be reborn, but perhaps with a twist. You know, Barfield said that an original sense of participation, as he puts it, goes through this sense of withdrawal and alienation, but then becomes, he sometimes calls it a reciprocal participation or a final participation. It's one that's renewed and understands something of original participation, but doesn't just reach back for it in a kind of nostalgic way, hoping to copy it, but actually finds these dynamics released once more. And so finding new expression once more. I know you've thought about sympathy a lot, and in terms of the extended mind and consciousness. And I think this is one of the reasons why it really matters. Emma talked about, you're questioning, is the sun conscious? And I suspect that part of the reason why people find that such an intriguing question is that it appeals somehow to the intuition that the light which pours on us on lovely days like today, at least, isn't just photons, a notion which people like Einstein actually were deeply suspicious of. In fact, it's a sort of useful heuristic he used to remark, I believe, but that it's at once an expression of the light of all lights, and that's why it warms us. That's why we feel lifted on a day like today when there's been so many grey days beneath it. It is flow of consciousness as much as it is purely a physical phenomenon and a feature of today's weather.
I think the sympathy point is very important. I mean, in my own hypothesis of morphic resonance, the idea is the whole of nature is connected together across time by, on the basis of similarity, by habits and memory and interconnection. And I think that the scientific worldview to which we're moving is one where things are much more interconnected. With mechanistic materialism has treated the whole of nature as a machine and causation as being sort of pushing and pulling mechanical causation. But I think what's happening now is the sciences are moving on beyond that. Partly it started with, well, Newton himself had this holistic vision. He's often credited with being the author of the narrowest kind of mechanistic materialism, but his theory of gravitation says that everything in the universe is connected with everything else. It was an ultimately holistic vision. And Faraday's vision of fields shows how things are related at a distance. It's not just little bits of matter totally separate. They're related through fields, the electric field and the magnetic field. And then that in the 20th century led to Einstein's theory of the whole universe being connected through the universal gravitational field. Newton didn't know how it worked, and Einstein suggested a field. And we have now quantum matter fields. Electrons and protons are vibrations in fields. And fields are extended. They're not just particles in a place. And as you know, I think our minds work like fields. I think they're extended beyond the brain in every act of perception. As you see us sitting here now, I think your images of us are not inside your brain, which is the official view, but actually right here where we're sitting, that you're projecting out your visual world, and our minds are extended in every act of perception. And I think that as the mechanistic materialist worldview breaks down, as it is doing, we'll have, in the science as well as in other areas, a much greater sense of interconnectedness, a sense that we're living in the living world. The whole universe is an organism, not a machine. The solar system's an organism, not a machine. The sun may be conscious, other stars may be conscious, whole galaxies may be conscious. The Earth, Gaia, is a living being. I think we're recovering a sense of this within the sciences. And interestingly, within philosophy as well, this is happening. In the last 10, 20 years, there's been a turn towards panpsychism. The idea that consciousness or mind may be present throughout all nature, not just confined to human brains and maybe the brains of a few other higher mammals, or even for liberal materialists, worms. This idea that there can be consciousness that's not just in brains, the whole universe may be a developing organism. These visions are coming into being, partly because materialism's incoherent. It says the only reality is unconscious matter. And then, of course, this leads to the problem, how come we're conscious? Because if brains are just unconscious matter. We ought not to be conscious. So some materialist philosophers pretend we're not. They've made a whole career out of arguing we're not conscious. It's just a folk psychology that makes us think we are. And that others are more explicit. Consciousness is an illusion. It doesn't really exist. It's produced by the physical activity of the brain. It doesn't do anything, but it's an illusion. This is the main theory taught in universities throughout the world and in philosophy of mind. But as the critics of that point of view say, to say that consciousness is an illusion doesn't explain it, because illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. And that's why it's called the hard problem. The very existence of consciousness is the hard problem. And so how do you get out of that? Almost the only way out of it is to say that consciousness is more fundamental than just something that appears in human brains. Either it's distributed through nature, as in panpsychism, in self-organizing systems at all levels of complexity, or consciousness is fundamental to everything, and then you have this rather surprising revival of idealism. The best-known proponent of it at the moment is Bernardo Kastrup, who's an idealist philosopher. And this is surprisingly successful. I mean, he's converting materialists by the droves. They're all going over to idealism, where consciousness is fundamental. So this, you say, mechanistic materialism and standard common or garden atheism of the kind that's just absorbed as the default position by the educated classes in secular societies, depends on a particular scientific worldview, mechanistic materialism, but the branch on which they're sitting is being sawn off at the moment. And that's going to lead to an even deeper spiritual, well, not so much a crisis, perhaps an awakening, a realize that the main reason why spirituality was cancelled, the mechanistic worldview, is no longer capable of cancelling the idea that there's consciousness underlying all things. All religions are idealist, ultimately, in the sense that the primary reality for all religions is consciousness. Divine consciousness, or if you don't want to call it divine consciousness, as in Buddhism, then it's just consciousness. But consciousness is primary. And so we're coming to a view where believing that the consciousness is more fundamental than just matter is becoming much easier to think and much more widespread and much more intellectually credible. I mean, there's a huge inertia of the default materialism that's been built into the educational system. It'll take decades before people have been educated into that, it ceases to be the total default. But we're changing, and I think that makes this whole spiritual opportunity aspect more pressing and more interesting and more urgent than it might otherwise be.
We need a program of decolonization, decolonizing the materialism from everything. But look, we might draw to a close there with our thoughts, and hopefully there'll be more thoughts sparked and surging up from within everyone else in the room as well.